Good evening, and welcome to our Civil Rights Conference. My name is Joy Murphy. Hold on just a minute. Okay, my name is Joy Murphy, and I am the Director of Learning and Engagement at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. This conference is a commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas landmark uh, civil rights decision. For this program, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Shawn Alexander, Professor and Chair of African American Studies and Director of the Langston Hughes Center at the University of Kansas. Before we hear from Dr. Alexander, we have a few housekeeping notes. Everyone received a link to the Eisenhower Library YouTube channel and the specific playlist where these events will stream. Each event has its own separate stream. Therefore, you have to click on each program to watch it. These programs will remain on our YouTube channel indefinitely. Also, currently, this playlist is private. Please do not share this link with anyone else. Finally, if you are a teacher, please put your name or email address in the comments at the start of each program so that we may provide a certificate of attendance for your professional development. Dr. Alexander is joining us. We are so glad to have you, and I am turning it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was getting in late. I didn't know the program. I'm a Mac user, so I couldn't use Safari. So
that's all right. We're just glad to have you.
Yes. But you can hear me and everything? Everyone can hear me?
I can hear you. I can see you. I think we're all good.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you all for joining, and thank you for inviting me and participation. I'm looking forward to the conversation and where we go from here in the discussion. So I've been asked to do kind of an impossible task, according to the title, and that is to talk about civil rights from the founding of our country to the modern civil rights movement in 60 minutes. So what we will do is we will pick up some highlights because I want to make sure also that I leave some time for questions in here as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually jump to the end of the Civil War, and we can ask questions if you have them about the previous time, and I can explain some of that if you have questions there. But I think the important thing is, for the sense of time, is to walk us from Reconstruction up to the modern civil rights movement with some different spots stopping along the way and telling us about the road to Brown, and which gets us to also Little Rock, etc. So we understand that the civil rights movement, or the slavery, comes to an end. We just had Juneteenth, right? Slavery comes to an end according to the Constitution with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which comes in 1865. It does not happen with Juneteenth. The 13th Amendment is actually passed in December of 1865, not in June of 1865. And there are many Juneteenths that occur around the nation. And as an example, Juneteenth is not the last place. Texas is not the last place that people that are enslaved find their freedom. Is there, whatever that means. A place like Kentucky or Delaware actually continue all the way up to the passage of the 13th Amendment. But you have the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which ends slavery in the United States with that caveat, unless for imprisonment. And then the next year we have in 1866, we have the passage of the first Civil Rights Act of this country. The first Civil Rights Act is passed in 1866. And that Civil Rights Act brings citizenship to African Americans, something that they're overturning the naturalization laws, which comes in the 1790s, right after the Constitution is written, and they pass the naturalization laws, which say that African Americans cannot become citizens of the United States. And so you have the change of that. People also talk about Dred Scott around that time, and we can ask questions about that if you have those. So 1866 is when this is passed. which leads us into the 14th Amendment, which puts that into the Constitution, along with due process and a number of other things. The 14th Amendment is a very long amendment and does a lot of different things. But for this purpose, what we're going to talk about, I want to emphasize is due process and citizenship. And you would assume that citizenship gets us into a position that would put people in a position to have the right to vote. But of course, the way that individuals react to it is they still disenfranchise African Americans in the voting process. And so we have the 15th Amendment passed in 1870, ratified, ending, it was first passed in 68, and then goes through the process and becomes ratified in 1870. That's the Reconstruction Amendments for the quick version of that. And the reaction to that, for the most part, by the nation is not positive. The nation, we look at Reconstruction as something that happens and moves us into this new democracy, is how it's often talked about, and America's taking their chance to create a new nation. But the gut reaction by the nation is very violent. And there's a fight over what is freedom and how freedom is defined throughout this country. And in response of that, you have groups like the Ku Klux Klan coming into formation in 1866, the same year that the Civil Rights Act, the first Civil Rights Act, is passed. And they begin to use violence, intimidation, terror to try to impose their vision and the Democratic Party's vision, run through the South mainly at the time, their vision of what freedom means, and trying to place that back into the society, even though society is moving away from that with these passages of Reconstruction amendments. And so you're going to have a bloody fight over a number of years. And between 1866 and 1871, 72, 20,000 people are killed in the South. That they are mainly African American, but a number of whites are killed in that Klan violence to impose these unnatural restrictions on these laws that are happening. And there's a hearing that takes place in the country, a congressional hearing that investigates it and challenges it, and which is a surprising thing and something we don't read enough. There are 8,000 pages of congressional documents or hearings that discuss what occurs, which then leads us to at the same time, and they come out of those hearings and they actually, in the Klan, say that organization can exist. And again, we can ask questions about that if you have them, but it moves us into the next wave of what's going on. The same thing that's happening in a reaction to that violence, again, is in the legal and legislative territory, that Congress begins to push a new civil rights bill beginning in 1870. And that civil rights bill the fight over it is to try to end discrimination in places of public and private accommodation, as well as education, that they cannot segregate, discriminate, etc. in the field of education. It will get hung up in Congress for 5 years. They keep trying to bring it forward. The main person that's bringing it forward is Charles Sumner. And Sumner is going to bring this forward over and over again in that 5-year period, always to be denied or tabled in Congress. Vote doesn't occur, vote does occur, and it gets voted down, etc. And then in 1875, Charles Sumner passes away. And there's a push by a number of his senators, fellow senators, to say, let's bring this bill back forward and let's pass it for the old man, as they say, to get this into being. And so then they're going to ultimately pass it in 1875. It will become the second Civil Rights Act ever passed by the country. And what it's going to do is it's going to say that you cannot discriminate in places of public and private accommodation. What is dropped is the education part. That's the thing that kept being the hiccup for the most part in the Senate. And the Senate decided that they could get it through as long as they took education out of that. And they are successful in that. So at that moment in 1875, we as a nation say that you cannot discriminate in places of public and private accommodation. Now, those who've studied the civil rights movement, bells should go off in your head and say, well, wait a second, what's the civil rights movement fought over? Right? And we know that it's fought over places of public accommodation, right? It's fought over restaurants, hotels, etc. It's one of the sparks begins, of course, with the fight over education, which opens the door, and we'll get to that. But on many levels, this is what, we've already passed a law, supposedly, that says you can't do that. So how do we get to the spot that opens the space for the creation or the fight that will lead to the modern civil rights movement? What happens is immediately states and individuals ignore the law. Not uncommon. They're already ignoring the 15th Amendment. They're already ignoring elements of the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship, etc., for African Americans. And so what they're going to do is they are going to build cases to go to the Supreme Court. One of those cases will actually occur here in the state of Kansas. In 1876, the year after the law is passed, a guy named Bird G. Will go into a hotel owned by a man named Stanley and request to have accommodations. Stanley does not rent a room to him, saying that he does not accommodate African Americans. He's not going to have him in his hotel, and Bird G. sues him over that discrimination. Again, this case will go all the way to the Supreme Court. It will build up. They were going to tie 4 more cases to it. Excuse me. They're going to tie 4 more cases to it. So 5 cases are going to go to the Supreme Court together. Those cases are going to reach the Supreme Court in 1883. And they're going to be called the civil rights cases, bundled together. That's the name that they're going to have. And the Supreme Court ultimately makes the decision in those cases that Stanley does not have to rent a room to Bird G. That he, excuse me, the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment does not force people to give, to put people in the spot, or does not force them to not discriminate, right? And so the Supreme Court makes that ruling. And what happens then in 1883 is discrimination is accepted in our country. It's by law. The Supreme Court says it's okay. The years right before that, you began to get laws being passed again because of the way the practice was happening in various areas, that people were saying, it's okay, don't worry about it. You can create segregation laws. We're not paying attention to the 14th, 15th Amendment. We're not paying attention to the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And so you began to see laws being passed in Tennessee around trains, streetcar trains, around hotels, etc. And then they build up and go. And then in 1883, they begin to expand broadly throughout the nation. And it's important to pay attention because what that does, again, is that creates the space for what we call Jim Crow. And those Jim Crow legislation will begin to be passed throughout the country, not just in the North, but they will also be passed in the South, or not just in the South, but they'll also be passed in the North or non-slave holding states, which is important to remember, because I just said that this case begins in Kansas, right? And Kansas is a non-slave holding state. Kansas is the place that loves to claim that they are the land of John Brown, right? They fought against slavery. It's the place that the Civil War began because they wouldn't allow slavery to be here. And of course, they're the place of Brown v. Board versus Brown v. Board of Topeka against the United States, right? And so what they're going to do is claim this, but segregation exists here, right? Foreshadowing or digressing briefly, just make sure that we understand that one of the reasons Brown v. Board is called Brown v. Board, and that one of the 5 cases that takes place is in Kansas, is because segregation exists in Kansas. So what this tells us right off the bat is that segregation, discrimination, that begins to develop in the Jim Crow era, as we talk about it, is not only a Southern phenomenon, it is a national phenomenon. It is something that happens throughout the country. And people do fight against it. They do challenge it, but whether it's upheld. Kansas passes a non-discrimination clause shortly after the Civil Rights Act of 1875, but it's just not upheld. And I'll give you a couple examples of that as we walk through. But this leads us to this. So you begin to get these laws being passed in the states. It will also begin to move us to the passing of discriminating on voting in more systematic ways, including in Mississippi, which will come up with a plan they call the Mississippi Plan in 1890, which will pass a law that says that you have to pay a poll tax. And then they add other aspects to that, including a literacy clause, etc. And in the 1890s, you'll get to a place like Louisiana that will add the famous grandfather clause, saying that if your grandfather could not vote before 1876, then you can't vote. And other aspects. And the other states will begin to add a poll tax. If they've just done a literacy clause, they'll add a poll tax, or maybe they'll add the grandfather clause, and it begins to spread in that manner, which will lead us again up to 1896, one of those pieces that people know more often than not, or talk about more often than not. And that is Plessy versus Ferguson, that occurs in Louisiana. It's over transportation. And it is about whether or not segregation can exist. It's really a challenge of that 1883 Supreme Court decision, and saying, is this okay? Is discrimination okay? The Supreme Court says it is, but we're challenging it because it's not fair that you're discriminating against someone who has the ability to pay for a first-class ticket, right? Or an individual that you cannot distinguish whether they are black or white. They are maybe passing, etc. And that begins to go forward. And when that decision is made, the Supreme Court rules that, of course, and as everyone knows, that famous phrase of the civil rights, that discrimination is okay as long as facilities are separate and equal, meaning they have to be equal. But we know that they never are equal, but that's what the Supreme Court rules. And that's what will lead us again to one of those fights that will come forth in Brown v. Board. And so we're moving through this time period in this way, but immediately at this time, African Americans begin to challenge what's going on. So right after the Civil Rights Act of 1883, you're going to have a man named T. Thomas Fortune, a newspaper writer in New York. He's going to call for the creation of a civil rights organization, a national voice to be able to speak out against these atrocities and challenge them in the court of law. And so he's going to call for the creation of an organization. That organization will ultimately be called the Afro-American League. It will form beginning throughout the country, small branches, and then come in 1890, the same year that Mississippi Plan is put into place. They're going to come together and form a national office, bringing all those branches under an umbrella. It's called the Afro-American League again, and it's the first national civil rights organization that's ever existed in this country. It's going to exist for a few years, then it's going to go dormant, and they're going to be resurrected as the Afro-American Council. And both of these organizations are going to fight to uphold the 13th, obviously, but more importantly, the 14th and 15th Amendments, try to end racial violence, speaking out against lynching, etc., trying to end labor, negotiate better labor contracts, etc. This is where Ida B. Wells actually is writing her work on anti-lynching activity. She is the anti-lynching chief of the Afro-American Council, and the pamphlets that many people know today about her anti-lynching material were actually written in the capacity of being the head of the Anti-Lynching Bureau in the Afro-American Council. They will also bring forth the first anti-lynching bill before Congress in 1901. And so when we passed ceremoniously a few years ago, the Senate passed a bill in the wake of George Floyd that, we're against this racial violence. This was a culmination in many ways of something that an organization started back in 1901 with the attempt, whatever we think of that ceremonious passing of the law in recent years. And the NAACP will come in the organization in the wake of this group. That group will fall apart around 1909. They will separate. The Niagara Movement is a group that comes out of this as well. And then the NAACP will be formed in 1909, 1910. picking up the mantle. Many of the members of the Afro-American Council and the Niagara Movement become members of the NAACP in their local areas and begin to push for the same thing, right? Upholding the 14th and 15th Amendment, challenging anti-lynching, or challenging lynching with anti-lynching activity. The NAACP will, in the 1920s will bring forth 2 more bills similar to what the Afro-American Council does, etc. And they will be pushing through a number of things at different times. And again, that's a lot of history in a short period of time with the NAACP, but you can ask me any questions with that that you find interesting. The one thing I will talk here briefly about a couple different things to try to give you a local example. And because I live in Kansas, I'll give you Kansas as that example of what's going on and how people are fighting different things. And it's also it leads us into the road to Brown, and shows us a little bit of an alternative history to that as well. So the University of Kansas, where I'm sitting right now, is a place that had segregation. They always allowed African Americans to join the university and be educated at the university, but they did have segregation. They segregated students in their lunchrooms, in different activities, including music halls, dances, etc. And again, it's a non-slaveholding state, right? And so we don't often think about that or talk about that, but it was here, and students began pushing against it. And those things came to a head in the 1930s. At the same time, the NAACP is beginning their road to Brown. They have hired Charles Hamilton Houston to do the actions to lead to Brown, to try to dismantle segregation in this country. And he's hired Thurgood Marshall, etc. But what's happening in University of Kansas is the University of Kansas particularly won't allow African Americans to join their medical school. Or being very specific, they can join their medical school, but they cannot take do their residency at the University of Kansas hospital. So they would ship them to Nebraska, to Chicago, Minneapolis, etc., to do the residency rather than stay here. And people are beginning to push against that. And they begin to call the NAACP to talk to them about it. And the NAACP gets on their side and actually begins to investigate it, and pushes a local politician out of a county just outside of Lawrence, Wyandotte County, which is on the Kansas City side of Kansas, so the Kansas City, Kansas area. And he takes the bill forward and has a hearing before the legislature. And he challenges the university for discrimination. And what happens is that the legislature actually comes back and says, University of Kansas, you are against the law, the state of Kansas law. We have an anti-discrimination bill passed, as I said, in the 1870s, and you're not standing behind it. So you need to allow African Americans to become part of the medical school, accept them into the professional schools, and do it now because you're in violation of the law. It's going to take a couple more years for them to do it. But the NAACP is going to pass on that case. Thurgood Marshall writes back to the students and the member of the legislature who's pushing it, and says that we need to go to a state that does not have an anti-discrimination clause. We need a state that is purely creating discrimination cases, but you guys are okay because you have this law and it's going to be fine, etc. That's a letter from Thurgood Marshall. And so they say, we're going to go to the state next to you. We're going to go to Missouri. And this is the beginning of Road to Brown. But that Kansas piece of the story is not often told, if ever told. And so what happens is the NAACP is going to go to the state of Missouri. They're going to get a guy named Lloyd Gaines, who's going to try to join go to the law school at the University of Missouri. He's going to be denied access to that law school based on his race. That case is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's going to be ruled that they are violating the 14th Amendment based on this, and that they got to give him the equal opportunity, and that they have 2 choices. That is to allow Lloyd Gaines to join the University of Missouri's law school, or they have to build a separate law school in the state for African Americans only. Missouri decides that they're going to not allow Gaines to go to the law school, that they're going to build a separate school tied to Lincoln University, which is in Jefferson City. Well, the law school is going to be built in St. Louis. It's going to take a number of years. Lloyd Gaines, completely different topic, but Lloyd Gaines actually disappears after the case. No one knows to this day where he went. He disappears. They don't know if he died, if he was murdered, etc. He was in Kansas City meeting Lucille Bluford, another activist and KU grad, and he disappeared when she was the last person to see him alive, or see him at all. But the ruling is a major victory for the NAACP, and that ruling is going to go through a number of cases that's gonna push us farther and farther in time and space. And so you see this happening. So the NAACP says this is wonderful. We've now got the decision by the Supreme Court that they have to provide, right? If they're going to segregate, the facilities must be equal, and that's where the extra law school comes in. And so they actually asked Lucille Bluford to bring a second case. Lucille Bluford, as I said, is a KU grad. She's a journalism grad, and she runs the Kansas City Call in Kansas City, which is a Black newspaper. Excuse me, still to today in the city, in Kansas City, Missouri. She's going to be denied access or admission into the journalism school at the University of Missouri. And so then the decision again comes back and says what you have to do is you have to build a separate journalism school. And the Missouri says, okay, we'll build another a separate school in this aspect as well. You can see what the NAACP's goal is to either get acceptance into the institution or in reality bankrupt the educational system, in forcing them over and over again to build new facilities for them if they're going to uphold segregation. The Bluford case also doesn't really get going. One thing I should mention that's an interesting thing that's going to come out in a new book in the fall by Crystal Sanders is one of the things that's happening in these institutions or in these states is students, using Missouri and Kansas as the example, Arkansas would be another example. They are sending Black students out of the state to go to school in other states that accept them, rather than desegregate or build all Black schools in their areas. So Lucille Bluford is a Missouri resident, but her tuition at the University of Kansas is paid for by the state of Missouri, so she doesn't try to go to school in Missouri. And this is a common practice that occurs over and over again throughout the South. And tied to that Gaines decision, the Supreme Court says that practice must stop. This is 1938. It does not stop. It continues, and people keep being in violation of the Supreme Court ruling, and states uphold it. It goes all the way into the early 1960s of them keeping, secretly paying for people's degrees out of the state rather than bring them to white institutions. That occurs. So the next two things that's going to happen in these court cases is we're going to have a case of a woman named Scipio who's going to try to go to the University of Oklahoma's law school. She, like Gaines, is going to be denied. And they're going to, again, the Supreme Court's going to come back and say you have to build these facilities or allow these students into the facilities. Oklahoma begrudgingly agrees based on this, but does not give adequate attention to Scipio in those cases. The second case, and again, the NAACP is going to fire back and come right back on the same institution again to hammer home the point, similar to what they tried in Missouri. And there's going to be a guy named McLaren, a guy named George McLaren, who is going to try to get into the University of Oklahoma's School of Education. McLaren is an interesting guy. McLaren, at the time of his attempts to get in the University of Oklahoma, he is near 60 years old. McLaren comes to the University of Kansas and starts his schooling at the University of Kansas in the 1920s. Then he will leave and go back down to Oklahoma, finish his degree at Langston University, and then get a job at Langston University, which he will teach at throughout the 1930s. He then will come back to the University of Kansas in the early 1940s and get his master's degree in education. And then after he gets the master's degree in education, he again returns to Langston University, and then also tries to enter the University of Oklahoma's education school from there. He is ultimately accepted into the university after a fight with the Supreme Court, again taking it all the way to the Supreme Court. And he's accepted into the school, but he's not given access to the space. There's famous pictures of George McLaren of sitting in the hallway of a classroom or outside a classroom. So they open up the class. They say he can enter the school, he can take the classes with the students, but he's got to sit in the hallway. Again, the NWS people challenge this as not having equal facilities and access to this material. And they will take him to the Supreme Court and say that he has to be able to participate. You can't hear the class right outside in the hallway. You can't be participating fully, etc. And he's not given equal access, as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision says. So ultimately, they're going to let him in the classroom. They do let him in the classroom, but they do mark the chair colored. And McLaren is the only one that will be sitting in that chair. No one will sit in that chair if he's not in the classroom. But he does get access. And it gives us, again, the next step in the court cases, right, of how they're going from access, full black, building a separate institution, to now access to the school, and then access to the classroom, etc. Which is going to lead us to the next case in Texas. And this is Sweat versus Painter. And Sweat versus Painter is kind of the last case before we move to actually going back to K through 12. And Sweat versus Painter, Sweat is going to enter, and Sweat, people pronounce it both ways, are going to enter into trying to go into the law school at the University of Texas. Based on the McLaren case, the University of Texas agrees and allows Sweat into the school, but they do not allow him in the classroom. They create a separate classroom for him in the basement of the law library. They do not grant him access to all of the law library. They give him a small amount of books in that space that he can use for his work. And only a handful of professors, not even a handful of professors, will come down and teach him in a separate, facility, separate space in that. And of course, the Supreme Court, the NWSP again will take that to the Supreme Court and argue that this is not equal access, that it's not equal. And the Supreme Court agrees that it's not just the facility, because he's in the facility, right? It's that he has to have equal access to everything, and that it has to be there. This is the moment that the NWSP is going to realize that they have the basis to now go back at K through 12 and argue the similar cases or similar arguments on K through 12. They've won it in their opinion. Sweat versus Painter is the last piece to the puzzle. He's not only accepted to the school, but he has to be in there and have full and equal access to everything, building off of McLaren. They've been working on the K through 12 on school year, because African Americans are not able to go to school full time. Oftentimes in K through 12, they have to take time off for harvesting, etc. And the teachers are not paid equal. So they've been challenging the individuals on making sure that the districts pay teachers the same. And that's been their push. But now they're going to move into actually the idea of separate but equal. And again, this is going to take 5 cases. And you're going to have a case in Delaware, Washington, D.C., Virginia, South Carolina, and Kansas. Kansas is the interesting case. So Kansas is the case that is not just about equalization, the facility. It's not because there's a dilapidated school in the state of Kansas or the city of Topeka. It's not because the facilities do not add up to the same thing that the white students have. In Topeka, Kansas, the school, it's unlike Virginia and South Carolina, etc. In Topeka, Kansas, all the grade schools are exactly the same. They were built around the same period of time. They were built by the same architect, etc. What the problem is that, using the old stereotype, Linda Brown has to go to a school miles away from her home. She has to walk down a railroad track, which she doesn't really have to do, but that's, what magazines take pictures of. But she has to go away from her school. She can't go to the school that's 2 blocks away. She must go travel to another location to go to school. She cannot go to school with her neighborhood, right? She lives in an integrated neighborhood. She can't go to school with people that she plays with every day, that come to her house and have lunch, as her mother will always tell you. Then, at different times, that they, it's a typical middle class, working class integrated neighborhood. Does racism exist there? Absolutely. But it's imposed more so by the school system. And so the NAACP understands that this is the key, because if they keep pushing to just equalization, they want to end segregation. And so it's a decision that they made in the 1930s, that they decided, do we want to go to equalization, just making everything equal, or do we want to end segregation and discrimination in all walks of life? The NAACP decides that that's the move that they want. They don't want equalization. It's important to note that W.E. Du Bois, the famous activist scholar, actually leaves the NAACP over that issue. He disagrees with them, and he challenges them at numerous times. And again, we can talk about that, but he feels that equalization is a better route to go than full ending of discrimination and segregation. I mean, in his mind, then you end the black institutions, you will end the black school, you will fundamentally end the black church, etc. And he argues again this point very succinctly in the Crisis magazine, which he edits, and leads to a fight. But that's the position that the NAACP takes. That's the position of Charles Hamilton Houston and his protege, Thurgood Marshall. And when Houston passes away on the eve of the case of Brown v. Board being started in 1950, Thurgood Marshall is going to carry that argument through the courts. And ultimately, the courts decide, in agreement with the NAACP, that it's not just the facility, it's all accesses of it. It's whether or not the education creates a psychological damage, whether or not the person has equal access to that location, whether it should be a neighborhood school or not. They're arguing that it should be a neighborhood school, that they should have equal access to these locations and the facilities, etc., which is a landmark decision. And this is the moment when we're going to start the modern civil rights movement. As I've talked about briefly, but throughout the time from the turn of the century up until this time, there are civil rights organizations. There's challenges to various discrimination aspects, trying to uphold things, uphold the 14th and 15th Amendments. It's not a point that African Americans do not fight in these cases. But what's going to be different is that by the time, once we get the decision in Brown on May 17th, 1954, they now have the court on their side. Many of the cases before, the court would continually, even though there was fighting and struggle, the court would constantly or continually side in the favor, at least on a precedent idea, with discrimination, right? Plessy is an example of that, right? The inability to pass anti-lynching laws, etc. These are numerous times that these are going to occur. But on May 16th, 1954, the Supreme Court and the law of the land is not on the side of African Americans. On May 18th, 1954, the Supreme Court and the law of the land is suddenly on the side of African Americans. And so what the NAACP and a number of other individuals are going to do is they're going to take that into their own hands and try to challenge the segregation in the way and argue back using the decision of Brown v. Board, which does claim, though it doesn't really do it, to end Plessy versus Ferguson, right, and end segregation in the nation. Of course, it doesn't do it because if it does, then you have no reason to have a civil rights movement, a modern civil rights movement, right? Because snap of the finger, segregation disappears. That's not how things work. And so you do have a number of instances that are going to lead us into this moment, but they have that court case and they keep building up those court cases. And a perfect example is in Montgomery, Alabama in 55, and the challenge of the bus boycott is trying to end segregation on the bus, right? That's a simple story, and we understand that, and they will not, individuals in the city will not ride the bus for over a year. All of you know at least the framework of this, of Rosa Parks. Many of you certainly know of Colvette Colvin, the individual who didn't give up a seat beforehand. Parks is not the only one. There are organizations in there like the Women's Political Council who have been leading things alongside the NAACP, and they're all ready to do this protest and challenge as they move forward. But the key is that while that protest is taking place, the NAACP is actually in the court arguing a case before the Supreme Court. So they're going to get a ruling that's going to force the buses to desegregate, right? That case has brought in 4 names, maybe 5 names, in the name of 4 or 5 women. Actually, the lead name in that is Colvette Colvin, and going forth. A lot of people don't know that her case is brought together with Park's case, et cetera, and argued by the NAACP to get that ruling. So you see how the NAACP and the legal structure is going to continue to fight and challenge things in the courtroom. It's not just the protests, right? Of course, coming out of this time period, you are out of this Montgomery bus boycott. You have Martin Luther King, a new minister in town, rising up to kind of being the figurehead of the movement, and we can again talk about that and what's going on with that. He's and out of that's going to create the new civil rights organization called the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which will come out of the South. And again, King will be named to that position in there, in the leader. And they'll do that in 1957. Of course, 1957 is the same year that we're going to have the Little Rock challenge in the Little Rock schools. It's important to say that's 1957. That's 3 years after Brown v. Board. So just the existence of Little Rock and the occurrence of what's taking place shows us that that segregation didn't end, that it's challenging, and it's a slow process that's occurring. You can find the documents in the Eisenhower Library of them talking about Little Rock and the events that are going there, and many things there. One of the most chilling documents there was found a number of years ago, probably about 10 years ago, and that's the letter from Beckwith to Eisenhower around Little Rock, and talking about blood in the street, etc. Right? If Eisenhower keeps pushing with this case and doesn't uphold segregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, and you often wonder in the way that these things are done. The individuals from Eisenhower can explain this as well. But the way that things are done is there's a point with letters that they just become pro and con letters, and they're just kind of thrown in piles. And so Beckwith's letter really wasn't seen for decades. And I often wonder what would have happened, of course, if Beckwith's letter would have been seen and people would have flagged him as an individual who was dangerous, right? Because 6 years later, of course, he will assassinate Medgar Evers in Mississippi and go in that activity. The 1960, we're going to have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee coming together. And the students involved with that, you're going to have the freedom rides. You're going to have the various sit-ins that are occurring. Of course, in Kansas in 1958, you have the first sit-in. It's before the sit-in of Greensboro, led by members of the youth chapter of the NAACP. A lot of the people that become members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, are actual members, are youth members of the NAACP, and they will continue to push various things. The jumping ahead, and again, you can ask me questions, but I want to try to hold it. I'm conscious of time, and I'm able to go over. I don't know if you guys are with questions, but I wanted to kind of wrap it up here so we can leave some time for questions. That a number of instances will occur, between 60 and 64. But of course, in 64, you get the Civil Rights Act passed, which will end segregation in places of public and private accommodation, really upholding that 14th Amendment, going back to that Civil Rights Act of 1875. And then in 1965, you're going to get the Voting Rights Act, again, symbolically in many ways, but different, is going to uphold the 15th Amendment, and talk about where voting can be, districts, etc. And elements of that Voting Rights Act, of course, have been dismantled in the last decade, which is something that's should be thought about and considered on what damages that decision in Shelby versus Holder had for us as a nation. And so then that leads us to the end of what we call the modern civil rights movement. It doesn't mean that segregation and desegregation occur, or segregation ends or desegregation completely occurs throughout the country. It doesn't mean that everyone's given the right to vote. People are going to still challenge that. And we're going to constantly have this struggle that's continuing, leading us up to today, that we're not in a situation. Have we made progress? Absolutely. As a nation, we've made progress, but segregation and discrimination still exist. And that's the reason that you have various organizations like the NAACP still around. That's why you have a movement like Black Lives Matter that rises after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, and has continued in various forms since then. And that reaction, in many ways, of the new violence that you're seeing, it's not new violence and happening. That violence has always been occurring, but that new violence that you're seeing because of technology, etc., in many ways is part of a backlash that's occurred really since the Reagan administration and Reagan and Bush administrations in challenging segregation and saying that we've gone too far with states' rights, bring states' rights back, etc. Reagan ran on that policy. All the way through Clinton and his welfare programs, etc. But it leads to the election of the first person of African descent elected to the presidency, and then we have, in many ways, a racial and violent backlash to that presidency, and we can see that through time by policy and action, leading us to today. So it is 5:50. Which leaves us with 10 minutes. That's a lot of information and way too much information. But I want to leave some points for questions. And again, Joy, I don't know exactly how much your timeline is stuck, but I'm able to go over if we have more questions.
Okay, we don't have a hard stop. So if people want, if there are still questions flowing, then we'll go until questions stop.
And I hope Brian gave me a very large topic, so I hope I did what you guys wanted. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this great presentation. I thought I knew a lot, and I even learned some new things. I'm not surprised by that, but I learned some new things. One of the things I wanted to ask you about while people are typing questions in the chat, and I'll also bring in the Clinton Presidential Library where they're live, so they may ask questions live. But before we do that, I have a few questions. So I'm here in Kansas, and one of the things that I learned when I first got here is that Kansas was actually granted women the right to vote well before the 19th Amendment is passed. And so, that is one of those things where you think of Kansas as this really progressive, that you have this idea that they might be somewhat of a progressive state, or at least at one point in time, they have been a progressive state. But then I'm listening to your presentation, and we're also thinking about Brown v. Board and all of these different desegregation or these trying to these times of segregation in Kansas, and like sometimes that, like for me, I don't know that I can reconcile that very well,
Yeah,
and
I
I don't
mean,
know if that's a question.
no, but I understand where you're going with it. So I'll first throw out a quote that I always use. So I am a Du Bois scholar, and Du Bois has a fantastic quote that says, "I'm an optimist, but I have eyes." Right? And I think Kansas fits that very much. So is Kansas the free state that everyone likes to say that it is? Is it as progressive as people like to say? No. But where is in the United States, right? Right. We just had an anniversary the other day. I forget the exact day, but of a lynching that occurred in Duluth, Minnesota. Right. So we're going to go all the way to the Canadian border, right, and understand that racial violence exists there. I think that the Kansas has made different times they are a progressive state, like other states, but then they also do make they are a place that segregation does exist, right? The city of Lawrence is supposed to be that blue dot, right? Blue dot in a red state. Is that what it is? So it's supposed to be the progressive area, right? But a lynching occurred here in 1882, right? It's a spot that doesn't have I was just talking to someone's writing on Lawrence the other day, and they're like, but Lawrence had, they were doing wonderful things, but something happened in 1890. I'm like, the nation is turning on race in 1890. So it's not that something happened. Lawrence followed the nation, right? With what they were doing. And so I think that, again, it depends on where you are. Time and space really matter. And so there are some pockets at different times that Kansas is very progressive, and there's pockets that it's not. But I think we have to interrogate those moments. So the Exodusters is a story that everyone likes to tell, and that they come to the state and people, help them out. They create relief societies, but those relief societies, more times than not, are started because the Black population begins to rise in that space, and then they raise money to move them down the river, right? And then that relief society ends in Lawrence, as using Lawrence as an example, and all of a sudden a relief society starts in Topeka. And everyone's like, look, they're helping out the Black population, but are they? Or are they just moving them down the river, right? So it depends on what's going on. That's a kind of a gray answer, but saying it's really time and space. So yeah.
No, that's a good answer. One of the other things that you talked about, you sort of talked about kind of this shift to, it wasn't really a shift, but people started to kind of really focus on states' rights, and there, of course, there were reasons for that. And what that brought to mind is a letter that I ran across. Actually, our supervisory archivist ran across. That is from Dr. Martin Luther King to President Eisenhower, asking for the Justice Department to step in because of the violence that the White Citizens Council is really kind of invoking on them as during the bus boycott. I think it was during the Montgomery bus boycott. President Eisenhower himself does not respond back, but a member of his staff does. Excuse me. And what he essentially says is, we can't step in. This is a state's issue. The Department of Justice can't step into this. We're giving this, the state has to ask us to come into it. And I'm bringing this up because I think about when we're talking about the civil rights movement and how some of these things have kind of, most of the things that have happened come from feds down, right? Top down. And so this conversation about, when, even this current conversation about states' rights, when do the feds step in? When do they step out? I think is a bigger part of this whole civil rights conversation. Um, I always say, despite where I work, and I do love where I work, President Eisenhower was more of a constitutionalist than he was really a very, strong supporter of civil rights. He wasn't really against it, but not super strong supporter. Um, but this idea of when the feds step in, when does it come from the federal government? When do the states step in? And why states' rights are such a big deal. And I guess I'm looking for a comment on that because that's not a question
Yeah,
either.
no, no. I mean, that's a great it's a great point. And states' rights is always going to be there, right? And states' rights is, I mean, is extremely important because it's, as you said, it's whether or not the based on the Constitution, does the federal government have the ability to step in and impose on a state the federal law, right? And that's how they get around different types of, leading from we're talking about, leading from writing the 15th Amendment, et cetera. Do they have, are they really infringing on the federal constitutional idea of what is the vote, right? Or are they slightly discriminating, but they're discriminating against everyone, right? Because they'll argue that, a poor white can't pay for that poll tax either, so we're not really discriminating, so the federal government won't come in, right? Even on the fact of lynching, that's something people don't pay attention to. It never gets picked up by as a federal law because the argument is this is a state murder case, right? And the federal government doesn't have the right to step in on a state murder case. They don't have the right until we pass the hate crime law, right? And so a lynching occurs in Leavenworth, Kansas, and they say, no, we can't go there because that's the state issue. And even if they don't bring prosecution, it's not our place to do that, right? And so it's always going to be there, all the way. The whites. And so let me get another thing with King, and the thing that you're bringing up is important. So he's learning this very, very early. If the letter that you're talking about is around the boycott, the Montgomery boycott, it's important because he's learning very quickly the federal government is the only spot that he has to get assistance, particularly the Justice Department. And he's not going to step over. Never in his career will he disagree with the Justice Department. If the Justice Department puts an injunction and tells him not to do something, he won't do it because he knows that if he makes them mad, he's got nowhere else to go. It's the little bit of protection that he has, and it's very little, right? And so the famous Selma March that everyone talks about, when King leads it over the bridge one day and turns around, prays and turns around. He doesn't talk to anyone and tell John Lewis why he's doing it. That's why John Lewis is so mad. But he's doing it because the federal government, the Justice Department, said don't march. And he knows that if he does, he's got no protection, right? And so it's going to be happening numerous places. Albany, Georgia, one of the greatest failures of the civil rights movement, challenging Laura Pritchard, the sheriff there, gets the federal government to actually tell King he can't march. And so again, King leaves. I mean, Pritchard understands what's going on, and I mean, he's kind of a brilliant strategist in that sense. Tries to tell Bull Connor to do the same thing, but Bull Connor can't help himself in '63. But so again, that federal government engagement is there, and the states' rights aspect. That's what I mean. Eisenhower, I think, on many of these issues at different times, communism was always kind of lingering behind him when you read those things in the papers. But at the same time, he's very much, that quote unquote what we would use today of a Republican liberal, right? He's got a liberal approach to some of the stuff that he's doing, and so he does feel that that maybe it's wrong, but how do I do it, right? How do I go forward with it? Very military, the desegregation of the military, all that type of stuff. He's doing that. On the states' rights, they're always going to come back and argue that they can't come in there, and people are going to push back from the state and saying this is our territory, right? It's what you can't do, and so to give you just some examples, this is why states' rights continues to be used in our rhetoric. I mean, it's used in our political rhetoric today that people are overstepping. It's used by Ronald Reagan when he launches his political campaign. He says that the federal government has overstepped their bounds. I'm for states' rights, right? He goes to, remember, Reagan announces his presidency not in California, his run for presidency. He launches his name for president in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Met on the tarmac by Trent Lott and a number of those Mississippi politicians that everyone began to know in the late 80s and 90s, etc., with Confederate flags flying on the tarmac, right? And he gives a famous speech there saying, "I'm for states' rights." Everyone knows what he's talking about, right? And the federal government's overstepped it. And that's the same. And Eisenhower has a similar problem because he's going to the states, and those imageries, because he's going to the states and he may not fully agree with what's going on when he's running for re-election, but he also has people in the South waving those Confederate flags, those Confederate battle flags, and there's constant tension. In fact, Du Bois writes this wonderful editorial in I think it's the Guardian, where he's frustrated because both candidates have Confederate flags at their campaigns, right? And he's like, "Who are you supposed to vote for in this position?" Right? So, but I don't know if that really answered it, but it's states' rights is so important, right?
No, it does.
Yeah.
I am going to bring, I don't see any questions in the chat yet. I am going to bring in the Clinton Presidential Library and see if they have questions from the audience.
All right, so I've got a couple questions, and this is Brian, Dr. Alexander. You did a fantastic job. You
Thank you.
Possible. Yeah. So first one says, since you said that the modern civil rights movement, historians will say that as well, ended in the 1960s, what would you, as a historian, call the movement today?
That's a good question. I mean, I use the modern civil rights movement as a distinction between pre-civil rights and what happens with what we're talking about in the 60s. But of course, we have a movement, you have different things occurring today. I don't know that we have a civil rights movement occurring between 65 and today. We have different activities, whether it's a sustained movement in the way, I mean, looking at social movements, whether it's a sustained movement in the same way that occurs between 54 and 65, or you could take that to 75 if you want to add the Black Power movement, right? And what happens in there. If we have a sustained movement in the same way that we do, you don't have that between 75 and 2000. You have different moments and different activities, different struggles, but a sustained movement doesn't exist, I would argue, until Black Lives Matter. And surprisingly, right, when Black Lives Matter occurs, everyone called it a movement the day after they launched the hashtag, right? And historians, scholars began to wait a second, right? But it sustained itself. And I think that's, if you understand what I mean, the activities in the pushing for changing of policy has sustained itself in a way that actually doesn't occur in the 90s, right? Actually doesn't occur in the same sense in the 80s. Is there activity? Is there push and challenge? Absolutely. But it's not a movement. No different than it's not a movement in the 1930s or the 1920s, right? There's sustained activity, there's sustained struggle, but not a movement.
All right. So the next one we were asked from the teachers, how can we ever hope to truly move past our past when over half of our country keeps putting people in power whose goal it is to take away progress in civil rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is when I very rarely claim to be a historian, right? My degree is in Black Studies, so but this is when I'll claim to be a historian and say, historians don't answer those type of questions. But but I'll do my best. So the biggest thing for me, I mean, I'm an educator, so I think that education is the key. I'm a Du Boisian, as I said before. Du Bois believed that, but Du Bois also got frustrated at different times believing, Du Bois used to always just say, if they just read and understood what I was writing, things would get better. So you have to, as an educator, you have to have that belief, right? That you're trying to educate the public. But the problem is that you have sustained activity that consistently attacks that education. And how we get those people voting into elected office to change that, I have no idea. I would say the biggest part is to get a bigger and better turnout, right? Our actual people who vote for the national office is a small percentage of our national population. It may backfire on me, right? And maybe we have people that, I don't like, more people being elected into office. But my guess is that if we actually got more people to vote and took the time to get those to vote, we would have a change, right? But we need to change that education. I mean, a thing that you guys should understand as educators, I think you understand it, but I'm going to put a point on it. The reason we're having a tax on Black history, on my department of Black Studies that's been here for 54 years, the reason we're having those attacks is because they're having an impact, right? There's success in what they're doing. They're challenging the narrative and trying to teach something that slightly lets someone know something different. I just gave you a 50-minute lecture on Black history, which is American history, right? There's nothing that's not American in that history. But you have people that constantly challenge you and argue that you're teaching something different, right? You're not teaching something different. And so, and the way that you can understand that is, again, I ended with a discussion of Barack Obama's presidency and the backlash to that. But a big element of the backlash that's occurred in the last few years that we've got to pay attention to is the publication of the 1619 Project in the New York Times. The fact that appeared in the New York Times and appeared the way that it did sent alarm bells throughout the people that don't want you to understand that history, right? And that's an extremely important thing to understand. Because of the success of that and the people talking about it and reading it, you begin to have a backlash, right? Including senators from Arkansas, right? Speaking out against that. And we have to pay attention to that and understand that, because that success puts you in a space that you're challenging that narrative that puts people that can't keep telling you that your rights are being discriminated against, etc., right? Because you show it. And the last thing I'll say with the 1619 Project, the important thing to understand is whoever, if you've actually read the project, they only talk about one thing in that project. And that's the introduction, written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. They don't talk about all the subsequent articles of that project that talk about the legacy of slavery showing in housing, health conditions, etc. They only talk about the introduction, which tells me that they're afraid to bring up the other topics because they don't have anything. So you're rewriting history, right? Why are we talking about slavery? That's what they're focusing on, rather than actually really show the substance of that entire project and what they're trying to show in the anniversary of the 1619 the individuals being brought, right, and sold in Virginia. That's an important thing to understand. It shows the weakness of their argument and why we need to push back on it, because they're frightened that if you pay attention to the rest of the material, you actually may learn something that's slightly different than they want you to know.
I got another for you.
Yeah.
And you teach English. You teach English. No, you're asking from an English teacher's perspective. Yeah. So this is from an English teacher.
Okay.
What were English departments like in 1890 Kansas? And
what were the beginning of the question? I didn't hear again.
Yeah, because the NLA did a study in like 2014 that the top schools were only graduating 2% of African Americans in English. And so I'm wondering how English was like in the 1890s when you were talking about how there was separate but equal in Kansas. And so what was English like then? And does English actually derive discrimination?
So English meaning the language of English, the class of literature. What are you talking about?
Yeah, like English education.
English education. So what is that like in Kansas in the 19th century?
Yes.
Gotcha. So, I mean, go ahead.
No, that's you're you're on the right path.
Okay. So, I mean, English is taught in the state of Kansas with, no different than any other place. The question becomes whether or not the individuals can go to school the entire time, right? So African Americans in the state of Kansas, like many other places, may not be able to go for the full, we'll use the 9 month, right? They may not be able to go for the full 9 months. They may only get a 4-month term because they have to go to and begin to work in the fields for harvest and also planting season, etc. And so they don't have the same amount, especially in those segregated schools, which is based on population in Kansas. It gets very complicated, but based on those areas. So the English education is there, but not great. In a town like Lawrence, it's going to be okay. Not wonderful, but it's going to be okay. I mean, an individual who experiences segregation here, 10 years later, the turn of the century, experiences segregation in Lawrence, but gets a very good education, of course, is Langston Hughes, right? And he's going to experience segregation and discrimination in his school, but he is being educated and doing well in his English classes. The exact materials of what they're teaching, I don't know. But it's not going to be that much different, I don't think, than other locations. It's really down to whether or not they have the textbooks, the funding to those all-Black schools, and how much time, right? Think about your students today, right? Think about if you took half of that class and you only taught them 4 months out of the year, and the other class you taught for 9 months, but you all continued to progress through the system, right? Those individuals that are only getting 4 months obviously are going to be continued to struggle as they move forward, right? And that's the type of system. So it's not just facilities and textbooks, etc. It's also that year, right? What is being taught and how much time is being given to these students, and that creates a discrepancy. That just creates disparity in education for generations of Black students, not just in Kansas, but also throughout the country. Does that answer your question?
No, I'm thinking it is more than that because English promoted, like they didn't promote African American writers.
I see.
Yeah, and so in my thinking, I think it's English departments that are to blame for the discrimination. That's going a little overboard, but I'm kind of referencing Richard Oman's English in America and how they really drive discrimination.
I see. So you're saying that the material itself, by not highlighting Black writers, Black individuals, etc., by doing that there's a discrimination, and in a I mean, to use the NAACP, what they will use, there's an inferiority that's built into the system. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that absolutely is happening, right? And we have to pay attention to that. There is studies on English, and they really come out. They begin at the late 19th century, but they really begin to come out in the 1930s, late 20s and early 30s. They look at not only English, but they also look at history and history textbooks, which is the same thing we're doing today, right? And they begin to talk about how those textbooks actually talk about Blacks in society. So when they talk specifically about Reconstruction, they will talk about Reconstruction from that myth, that story that it's a time period when it was the tragic mistake by the nation. They should have never put Blacks in power in the thing, that they were incompetent, etc. It will talk about high sex drive, etc. And they begin to look at those textbooks and challenge it. And so Du Bois is one of those people that does it, as is the Association for the Study of, at the time, Negro Life and History, now African American Life and History. That organization started by Carter G. Woodson in 1915, still around today. They're going to challenge it and do it. Franz Boas is going to look at it as well. The anthropologist is going to be talking and investigating this type of stuff. So they're going to do it, and there's going to be a push to change those textbooks. which I think is getting closer to what you're asking. There's going to be a push to change those textbooks and challenge them and begin to get a better story, a better understanding, incorporate more material. The NAACP is going to create their own classes in the 1930s to do in various branches. And so James Weldon Johnson, famous writer and NAACP activist, he's going to create a syllabus on what he gives, readings and things that he wants every branch to teach those branches. So do extra type school activities to bring those Black writers, Black artists. They're going to have a history class. They're going to have a sociology class, all brought to those branches, and to begin to challenge that notion of what are they talking about, and how, if they are talking about African Americans, to change the narrative of what they're talking about with African Americans. Does that get more to your question then?
And I think it continues, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all from Little Rock, Dr. Alexander. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm glad good to see you. I can only see, this is a new program for me, so you're on a small screen, but it's good to see you guys. Are you guys the whole week? Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, very good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. I'm going to ask you a question that I asked Mr. Morrow earlier today. I'm going to try to ask every presenter who goes through this week. And it's simply, what are civil rights?
What are civil rights? That could be broadly defined, right? I'm sure that's the same thing they told you earlier. So it depends, right? So civil rights are based on rights that are guaranteed by the state, right? They are civil. So they're rights that are gained, but then people can add to it whether or not they're human rights, right? So you get into that great debate of are we trying to do civil rights? Are we trying to do human rights? Are they social equality? Or is it civil equality, right? So I'm going to give you a very gray answer, but that's the constant fight that we have, right? So what does the nation uphold as people's rights? And those can be broad, right? That we all should have. And then, again, they argue at different times, well, give me my civil rights, but social equality, maybe not there. I don't need that. Meaning I don't need to, the turn of the 19th century, I don't need to live next to you, but I should have the right to vote, right? I should have the right to eat in a restaurant if I want. I should be able to go to a library. Those are things that are civil rights. But then Malcolm X will tell you in the 1960s, that's not enough, right? That civil rights are not what we're arguing for. We're arguing for human rights, and rights that are given to us as human beings, and that all people should recognize and understand. And I think I kind of fall more in line with that, especially if we're going to uphold the Constitution, that begins to argue in every state, as every state begins to push that idea that not Thomas Jefferson said the first time, right? But African enslaved individuals argued to the Massachusetts legislature that they're created equal, and they all have rights that should be recognized. Those natural rights given to us that comes through with the Enlightenment period, and if we're going to believe that, and every constitution is going to uphold those, then they should back that idea with everyone. So, but it becomes complicated, right?
Well, we like gray answers. Gray answers make you think a little bit.
They make you think a little bit, exactly. So because you have to debate that. What is civil? What is not, right? And that changes over time with people's different interpretations and things like that, right? So what, my favorite thing is what the founders claimed, right? Which no one is actually looking to go back to that founders constitution, right? So never believe anyone that says, I'm an originalist, right? Original means that women can't vote. Slavery exists in our country in 3 places in that constitution, right? Right. So there are many things in that constitution that no person, I hope, I say that with all, I really hope no one really believes that they're originalists, right? So that definition has changed over time.
All right. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat. We're going to ask one more time if there are any more questions at Clinton.
Someone's saying something.
No. That's me. The echo.
Okay. All right.
All right. No. All right. So then thank you so much, Dr. Alexander, and thank you everyone for watching. Tomorrow we will be live from the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum in Abilene, Kansas. If you have
Great space. You need
registered,
to go there. So
yes, please come. If you haven't been here, please come. If you haven't been here in a while, come back because it's a new museum. Um, if you have registered to join us in person in Abilene, we will be ready for you at 8:30 a.m. in the library courtyard. We will start our virtual presentations at 9:30 a.m. with an overview of the day and another presentation from StoryCorps. Then we go right into a presentation from Dr. Micah Kubik, Executive Director of the Kansas ACLU. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great night.
thank you. And you can always reach out to me if you have questions. Don't be afraid.
All right.
Have a great week, guys.